We're done.
Hello, Parallel Perception community. This is Angel Samadhi back with Lujan Matus and our deep dive of the power of emptiness. Before I go over a recap of what we did yesterday, we wanted to address, well, actually, maybe I should recap first. Okay, so on the third video, if you have not gone through the 3 videos prior to this, this is video 4 of 5. So please go back and refer to the other videos. So what we did in the third video was we talked about how we develop devotion without motive, how we can benefit from our hallways of awareness, how to be aware of our own omnipresence to facilitate divine timing, and the riddle, do we realize or do we really realize truth? And in that, we talked about, or we'd like to talk about, knowing what needs to be known, especially when you're under the tutelage of a teacher who is there to help facilitate you. As you guys may or may not know, Lujan is available for online spiritual guidance, usually twice a month, so that you can get some of your questions answered. And that's one of the easiest ways if you're not going to be able to come in person or online to do the Lo Ban Pi training. So as a student, as you're connected to these works, you have the opportunity to receive guidance from Lujan. So his role as a teacher in our lives and making sure that we understand, what do we realize or really realize? Lujan, tell us about how you facilitate that for us.
Well, if I become aware of something, there's a very, very strong feeling within the center of myself to identify what I've seen, to identify what I'm feeling, and not to cater to an original emphasis of a motive, because the motive itself may not be productive, or it may not be useful for the student. And if I cater to that motive, then I ruin my integrity by lowering my standards. But I prefer to keep a high standard and look at the motive, and then put that in the mix to have a discussion about what the motive is, and not compromise myself in any way whatsoever. Because if I'm aware of something, I'm obligated to reveal it. And through that revealing, there is a symbiotic response between student and teacher to follow the indication that the person had put forward to the very end, so that they have a voluminous amount of information about one subject, and that one subject has to be truly navigated with an enormous amount of intelligence, so that the person doesn't become offended, and also the teacher doesn't demote themselves by catering to something which shouldn't be catered to. And in a lot of cases, people do cater to other people to gain favor. I'm particularly not into gaining favor through this method. I would prefer to have the difficult task of speaking straight to what is really seen.
It's nice to know that sometimes, as we're kind of trying to listen to that reverberation off our own drum in terms of what is truth and what needs to be known, and realize that if we have a teacher-student relationship, that there's another set of eyes that is on our behalf, helping us to see impurity and helping to prune those initial flowerings that could be sour fruit. And so I appreciate,
even if they're just habitual habits, which are a line of intention which has been beneficial up to that particular point, but they're habitual. And people usually follow habitual lines because they have a background of sustainability with that habitual behavior. So you break the cord to that habitual behavior, so it can backtrack to the original source and re-identify itself, and then go off into another tangent, instead of facing the basic premise of an incorrect inquiry of the world, or an incorrect inquiry towards somebody else and towards yourself simultaneously. So the main thing is to be open and honest to such a degree that everybody's evolutionary process is challenged by the fact that they have to adapt to the very nature of what's revealing itself, so more wisdom can be gleaned from it. If you ignore that, there's a really big dangers, and a lot of people don't have the guts or the courage to actually speak to these types of things.
No, because sometimes they're met with resistance and conflict, or they're misunderstood and feelings get hurt. But if you can recognize a pattern that is within us meaning all students that are able to benefit from your tutelage, that if you're able to recognize a pattern that we've been stuck in for whatever reason, cultural indoctrination, just holding on to things, like some of the people, as we were talking, that are coming out of shamanism, that just cannot let go of certain aspects, and that those create destructive patterns, that you can not only help us nip in the bud the true knowings of that moment, but to help us spot patterns that may be destructive that we may not be aware of.
Okay, now
that's beneficial.
This is really interesting, because when you look at a habitual pattern, it's described as a wooden spoke. Now, the wooden spokes are very solidified, very, very hard, very destructive when they're rolled through an environment. If you understand that's a habitual state which uses a repetitive loop, or a circular loop to redefine and change the edifice of something into something deemed more intelligent, but it crushes through something which can't be seen, as a wheel that's holographic within its nature, and so permeable that the wooden spoke passes through that permeability of that particular wheel. The wooden spokes don't even realize they're going through that impermeable state, and that impermeable wheel has got eyes in every direction watching what's going on, and receiving the full gamut of information from the wooden spoke, and then reinterpret the wooden spokes within the holographic realm of prediction, the way that this predicts how the information has to be imparted, which corresponds to the resistances that came from the spokes, the hub, and the full ramifications of this wheel recycling itself over and over and over again. And I'm not talking about reincarnation, because this is just one. When you come back, you're empty, and you start again, and you make varying mistakes. Not from a previous lifetime, but just a lifetime you're dumped in is just a new beginning. And without a fundamental foundation of the human capacity to lead someone from childhood to something more enlightened, is very difficult in this world, because we're born in situations where we're socially bound by the parameters of an engineered circumstance, which is only responsive to the circumstances in comparison to what we need to do to live, instead of looking at what we need to do to prepare to die.
And we're going to look at that a little bit later in when we discuss going through the Bardo, and how we can be re-triggered into rebirth in a not so favorable situation, depending on how we handle that. So we're going to talk about that a little later in this video. So
yeah. And that's so, and I just want to reiterate something that's got to do with the responsivity of say that somebody's got a drum inside that goes boom, the drum goes back to the other person. So this goes boom, 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 back and forwards. So it's a reiteration of something, and then it makes an exchange, and soundboards become something else. It may be traveling somewhere in terms of its different variables, but it's actually traveling nowhere. It's just going like this as a wooden spoke. It's going around in a circle, and by the time you get to the end of that cycle, or that circle, your life's over. And then when you die, you come back and do it again. But you go into Bardo with the reflective mechanisms of that particular cycle, which hasn't been resolved. And when you go to Bardo, it's devastating, because your discernment is so refined at that particular point. And that refinement, if anything comes at you, it amplifies itself into such a magnificent illusion that that will move you, your etheric nature, in such a dramatic way that you lose your discernment in terms of saying, this is not real. Stand strong, let it pass through, because what's behind that is what I'm really meant to see. Isn't that like life?
Yes, and that we're going to go into in a little bit more detail in a few chapters. But
yeah.
If we may, I want to start with morphogenesis, and we're going to start with the morphogenesis chapters, since we finished with the riddle in the last video. The other chapters that are going to be included in today's video are going to be the misplaced memories, parts 1 and 2, the undoing, be in the world and not of it, and the passerby. Those last two really feed in off of each other, so we'll kind of talk with them together. So let's see, you have a quote on morphogenesis that I liked. Knowing and doing is homeostasis, while not doing is morphogenesis. I like that. So I had to look up, of course, the origin of the word. We think we know, but just to make sure. Morphogenesis comes from the Greek morphe, meaning to shape, and genesis, meaning creation. So it literally means the generation of form. Now, in biology, that means it's the formation and differentiation of tissues and organs. In geology, it's the formation of landforms. But in spirituality, we seek to transmute our knowledge and doings of our original nature of thoughtlessness into body intelligence that we receive not from the mind. Would you expound on the spiritual meaning of morphogenesis, since mine is limited?
Well, was that a description from the dictionary, that last one?
No, that was something I kind of put together from your work.
Oh, yes. I was just going to say, well, that's pretty.
But I know it's limited. I know it's limited.
Well, when anything comes inside of you, is it when you don't do it, you don't build upon the doing, you deconstruct the doing, and everybody's always sending the restrictive nature of their doings into your body. Then you have to undo that. So undoing that, you undo yourself, and also you help undo the other person. So it's really important as a collective is to help our fellow man and fellow women, to fellow human beings, to basically exchange. Yet you don't hold those exchanges in a very, very rigid manner, but to let them go immediately and allow your own insights to come to the surface, to speak to the maybe what wasn't realized by the delivery of somebody who's giving you a certain amount of information, and they feel that they're gleaning something. But by having just imagine you've got somebody in a teepee. I read about this in Shadows in the Twilight, and somebody gives their experience. They put it on the table. Now there are enormous amounts of variabilities in terms of what each person is going to realize. But upon what each person realizes, there is a collective unification of insight in terms of the intuitive capacity for them to know exactly the same thing, but from alternate perspectives. Yet there's one anchor point in terms of the intuitive nature of people that want to really make a true exchange. So I experienced this with a friend of mine that in Bali. His name was Jiwi, very, very beautiful guy, and I would have a realization. I noticed, this guy's realizing exactly the same thing that I'm realizing. He's not telling me. So I'm going to ask him, what are you realizing? And he said, well, I was realizing what you were realizing because you had a formulation of feeling. I got that feeling. I formulated that insight in exactly the same moment you did, because we're one person at that particular point. And this was quite extraordinary for me, because the Balinese consider Western people Arang Hantu, which means white ghost. It means without substance. Which is kind of like very reckless to consider that a race of people don't have substance, because somebody's going to have substance somewhere along the line. You can't really generalize like this, but they generally do this to justify what they're going to do in every 14 days when they do something to someone. That's what you've got to be careful about black magic around these particular periods. But to have a general experience exactly the same as somebody else, the variables are very, very important in terms of allowing the insight to be gleaned in such a way that when they listen to you, they hear the resonant field within your experience instead of the cerebral understanding from the words. They get the resonant field of feeling, and the resonant field of feeling creates an image for them, which has got nothing to do with their thoughts, but everything to do with what they're visually seeing, to put a composite a gravity of information inside them so they can verbalize it. Now, yeah, did I go too far?
No.
So it's so when this occurs, then that variability gives substance to everybody in different aspects, and it flies through the group in terms of realization, and this is what we're not doing. This is not what we're not doing that anymore. So we have to try and get back to this intuitive state, so that we can actually see that there's no difference between races of people. There's the difference is that we've been given the barrier of difference, and that doesn't really exist. So because we can pick a flower and say, well, it's not even our species. It's just from a different phylum. It's on this planet. But the thing is, when we pick up a flower, we appreciate the different colors. Why can't we do that with other people?
Exactly. I like that. That's so simple, and allow all of the wildflowers to grow together and just be beautiful as a field.
That's right. That's right.
So what you just described can, while we're seeking not to do ourselves and others, like on a one-on-one situation, we talk about the conflict or the foreplay you were saying between ourselves and the other, or our thief and our ghost, and their thief and their ghost. Can we look at that more as a collective when we're trying to learn how not to do the world? Is the conflict, the ghost and the thief within world harmony, or the lack thereof?
When we look at from the standpoint of the ancients, in terms of how they came upon the very, very subtle element before we go to sleep, and the very, very subtle element before we wake up. These two variables have to be honored. I think we've spoken about this in a previous interview. But when you go from your normal state of awareness when you slip into sleep, is that there's a notable point. With some people that talk to themselves, they go to sleep with the voice. Some people have visualizations, they go to sleep with visualization. Some go to sleep with both. If you can go to sleep without that, and just the content of an open reservoir of feeling to begin, the only thing you take into that is your original character, without any emphasis upon anything else other than the abstract notion that you go through the gateway of emptiness into non-defined state. And then when you if you don't go into dreaming, you come out of that non-defined state and you enter another stage of eternity, which is empty of itself as well. So you wake up from that, but you don't realize you're in that until you fully wake up, and then you go, okay, if I wasn't dreaming, what was I doing before I woke up? And it's very, very difficult to identify where that is inside of you, but it hasn't amplified a nightmare or a dream. It's you've amplified exactly what you went to sleep with, only the reference of what am I meant to grow into. And I don't know what I'm meant to grow into, but I'm going to be sustained by a certain amount of emptiness while I drop into the place where I may start dreaming, or the place where I may have visions, or the place where I may have realizations. And then when I come out of it, and this is what normal people do, they drop into dreams. But if I make a statement for myself, I drop into with a feeling of gratitude, and I go through that area of emptiness with a feeling of gratitude. Then that gratitude is the only thing that is viable for the emptiness to actually, you just sort of incrementally go through it with the gratitude, and then you may go into a total emptiness. And then when you come out, you're empty of the gratitude, yet the gratitude itself for life will be emphasized when you wake up. But before you wake up, you won't realize that the gratitude has entered the empty space, but the empty space will empty you of gratitude. And as you wake up, you have gratitude for life. So there are two empty points. And if we navigate these perfectly, navigate these the best way we can, if we go to sleep with gratitude, we'll wake up with emptiness, but we'll be grateful for life itself, no matter what we've gone through. So what will be amplified is the gratitude in the beginning, but emptiness or the non-foundational effect of emptiness will not interfere with us at all, but it'll give us the amplification of gratitude when we appear in the world. So, and you know, if you wake up, you know the old saying, wake up with your right foot forward. Now, what if you wake up and you have a bad feeling? Put your left foot down first. Empty yourself of everything that you don't need to have in your life, then put your right foot forward. But if you can't put your right foot forward and you wake up with a bad feeling, put your left foot down and put it into the earth. Put your right foot forward. Did you understand what I just said? I'm being terrible today.
I'm processing it. So, but that's a grounding technique if I don't. So what I got, was that because I made a note for us to talk later through the passerby and be in the world and not of it, about the two, you mentioned those two techniques and one or two different techniques, and that's one of them of how what to be in those two moments of emptiness. But I wasn't sure. I think I'm understanding that it's okay, because I normally fall asleep with some soundtrack or music on to help quiet the noise of the day. So whether it's instrumental and it's, the singing bells, or, just something beautiful, gentle, light to kind of help stop that loop. But I was wondering about, like sleep affirmations, if they help during that time. But again, does that take us into dreaming? I see you frowning.
Am I frowning? Am I?
Yeah, you're frowning already. And
I put my glasses back on. There you go.
No, because I can still feel it.
I wasn't frowning. I was actually listening to you very, very carefully.
And so
you're such a beautiful person.
I'm hearing is that if we go to sleep in the attitude of gratitude, that will
that's it. The attitude of,
and then we wake in that state.
Yeah, the eternal process is the only thing that you really come to terms with the eternal process is to be grateful that you won't know everything. You don't know everything. Be grateful that you're actually alive, and that you can spread the wealth of your gratitude. And this goes into the very fundamental fabric of the universe is love base. But to enter the subtleties of a universal process in terms of all the transdimensional aspects of it is to be grateful. And to be grateful is to be in a state of reception, to receive exactly what you need to receive. And when you receive exactly what you need to receive, you then begin to realize there are rules and regulations. I mean, we talked about this, about the rattlesnake, and about respecting the boundaries. And when you respect the boundaries, then it will never bite you ever again. So it's just a communication with the holographic reflection of our determination to know the world, yet we only know the illusion of the world. We don't know exactly what we're looking for because we've lost touch with this eternal process. So it's so when you look at it, the only thing that really matters is gratitude. But when you slide into the waking world, then you won't realize that the gratitude has been withdrawn from the emptiness before you wake up. But you're full of gratitude when you wake up. I look at my wife and say, I'm so grateful I got her. I have a contact with you. I'm so grateful for you. So then that is amplified gratitude even gratitude for someone who's just been terrible. I'm grateful for that because it makes me realize I don't want to be that way. So or I'm grateful for that because it shows me there's a danger. There's a danger there. Yeah.
I'm sorry. That's a great way to look at it. That's a really good way to look at it. I'm grateful for what I don't want to be.
Yeah, I'm grateful for what I don't want to be. But the thing is, with the emptiness that when you come into the world, you don't realize that you're traversing that emptiness because you only amplified gratitude in the beginning, because gratitude is the only thing that the only thing you can do to come to terms with the repetitive and the repetitive loop of our reality. To break through that, you've got to be grateful. And when you're grateful, there is something in the world like the chant. the book in the part where the chant is. Now, this happened right here outside my front door, but when you look at the chant, it's been put into India and everything like that. So once eternity gives you a boon, it gives you the possibility to actually see that you're being observed, and gives you a power with that observance. It's watching you whether you'll take advantage of the power, or you'll just realize that you're being observed, and that you'll be humbly say, well, I don't want the power, I can see I'm being watched. So when people go through the chant, they'll realize what I'm talking about here is in terms of power, which is like a power is given to you like on a golden platter. Should you take it, or should you realize that you're being watched while you take something you shouldn't acquire? You know, and then it comes down to power or gratitude, power or simplicity. Yeah.
So can I liken this into the example that you gave regarding the power or a city that you had to kind of push that energy toward other people that you decided not to take, and that's a way to not take the power, but rather to observe in gratitude?
Observation of your abilities. If you have a particular ability, then to ignore that particular power, because powers become available once you go beyond a certain threshold. Power, all sorts of temptations of power come toward you. Are you going to engage in that, or are you going to bypass that temptation and find out what's beyond that temptation itself?
Okay,
it's very, very plain and simple. So it's and this is everyone's tested with this in real life.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? I've got the capacity to either not be there for someone or be there for someone in the wrong way, which means you're manipulating the other person with a very fundamental power of communication. Now this is wretched as far as I'm concerned. So the power that you've got to in terms of your communication really means that you've given me your weaknesses, you've given me your strength. Will I take advantage of your weaknesses? Will I deceive you and take away your strength? This is wretched. So when someone gives you their weaknesses, their love and their devotion and everything like that, you say that, okay, their weakness is their vulnerability. That vulnerability is really their strength. So if you don't use someone's weakness against them, they become stronger. So you take that very tenderness and you give it a platform where it can actually sit safely to grow through the mechanisms of not being interfered with, not being altered in any way by some deviousness. So this becomes their strength. But if you take their weaknesses and bury their weaknesses because they're innocently saying, "Well, I trust you," then that weakness can turn into that fundamental trust can be turned into something else. And also someone's strength. You can see someone's strength, and you say, well, that's is their strength their weakness, or is their weakness their strength? This is the very thing you've got to ask yourself when you're interacting with people. And if they give you their tenderness, you never abuse that tenderness, but you speak directly to it if that tenderness turns into something else, because they don't understand the weaknesses and their strengths either. So that's a very, very big area to navigate with somebody, and it requires an enormous amount of diligence not to step on people's toes. And if you do step on people's toes, you've got to be very careful how you do it. It's got to be done in such a respectful and refined way that they can't escape. Yeah, because these very same principles are what we're all navigating, quite frankly. And we're not navigating it in a way which is respectful for ourselves or other people. So don't compromise yourself and don't compromise somebody else. So if you have thoughts, have good thoughts. If you have feelings, have good feelings. If you're going to say something, then say something that has relevance towards the circumstance and bolsters the truth. Don't say anything. If you can't say anything really good, then don't say anything at all. Yeah, and if you can't act nicely, then what are you doing? Just be neutral wherever you can, completely until you work into a definite state of refinement, which has got nothing to do with the habitual habit which you've been taught to display, because that's an engineered process, and very, very self-destructive engineered process. And to come upon new realizations very difficult with an engineered process, because you've been given justification to be mean, to be resentful, and everything like this. They're like the weeds among the wheat. Who put them there? Who put those weeds amongst the harvest of our consciousness? There you go.
Okay, and
so
then
that's sorry, that's backtracking to what we said before. So it's a reiteration of the weeds and the wheat in another way.
I like that. And so if when we're talking about these thoughts, if we get caught up in loops of, mind and, basically sour fruit, you also mentioned being able to take in, don't think the thoughts, but breathe them into the belly and release them, that will stop the thought process?
Well, if someone's got a thought process, yes, you breathe your thoughts. You sink your body in. You sink your mind into your body. Sink your body into your mind. Sink your mind into your body, so that you leave this behind, because it's meant to be disconnected. It's not really meant to be grounded in thought forms. It's meant to be highly elastic in terms of its spirit aspect. Because we can't get into the spirit aspect if we've got a mantra in there or a thought process which is eating up all the elements of we've got Jing, Qi, Shen. Jing is what you've been given by your mother. Qi is the animation that your heart acquires through the energy of what's been given to you through birth. And then you've got your spirit process, and spirit process, Jing, Qi, Shen, has been altered by a thought process instead of a realization process. So then when it goes into the spirit process, the Jing, Qi, Shen leaves the physical framework and becomes something else other than the Jing, Qi, Shen of the body. It becomes the Jing, Qi, Shen of the spirit process. Once you enter the spirit process, then you realize that there's an enormous amount of access to an energy which you didn't have access before, and it's from the universal aspect of oneself, which is an endless deposit of energy, even though you don't have an endless amount of energy in your physical body. And then you've got animation. The universe animates the spirit process. It all intertwines in a very, very interesting way. So then the animation process of the universe becomes animated within you, and then you access something other than your human condition. You access something else, and then the spirit process becomes heightened in terms of what is really rotating in this the comparison of the process of your own spiritual process then is defined in a way which is much different to what you expect. So I'll revert back to an experience that I had maybe 3 months ago, maybe 2 months ago. I'm not really sure about the time span. I know the experience. And I spoke to my wife about this, and she had a totally different perspective in terms of my memory, which was kind of very interesting. But I went through a process, and I saw the fractalization of consciousness revolving in a way which folded in and out of itself. And remember yesterday we talked about the line in between yin and yang. It folds in between itself and then becomes something other than what you expect. What you really thought you knew, you didn't really know, because it moves to an alternate perspective. So then the process of the animation of maybe God consciousness, or the universal consciousness or cosmic consciousness that comes upon you, and then you realize you don't know anything. So you set aside your condition of realization to allow the universe to realize things for you. And this is a spirit process. And as it realizes, you allow it to realize itself for you. You're given a visual image. That visual image becomes a composite of information, which will enter you and release itself from you in verbiage that you had no idea that you had access to, because you allowed yourself to actually visually be standardized by the limitlessness of the limitations of what you saw within you. Like I said, oh God, I don't really realize what I'm seeing. But what I was seeing becomes a deposit of information, which becomes something I need to listen to while I'm communicating. And then I begin to, then everyone, when they're in this particular spirit process, well, then you're transformed, your voice is transformed. And this particular voice has so much information contained within it that you're humbled by the fact that something which is a process, which is a Jingqi Shen process outside of your normal Jingqi process, it enters you and then changes the internal process, because the external process is alchemized in such a way that it drops inside of you. You change in one lifetime 1,000 times. So the dying process is let go of who you are, become who you're really meant to be, and who you're really meant to be you can't decide. And as you can't decide who you're really meant to be, you've crossed through Bardo. You've discovered something in terms of your growth process which is amplified and sped up one lifetime into 10, maybe 15 lifetimes in one really quite dramatic journey. And you have to handle it.
Mm-hmm. And that was one of the questions you said we should have as we're doing this Bardo technique in before sleep, is to also have that question, what am I meant to grow into? And so that takes us, what you're doing is leading us right into misplaced memories. And I want to hear more about the memory that Ms. Bob recalled differently. But just to wrap up, that you, with the living Bardo technique that's done in the twilight of slumber and at awakening, not to seek to dream, but to remember that the goal is emptiness. Now, misplaced memories. Let's get into that.
I want to tell you something really funny, because with misplaced memories, I wanted to call it Part 1 and Part 2. Instead of Part 1, Part 2, and all my students said, "No, Luhan, don't do that. You're letting people into the beginning of the chapter about the donkey." We won't talk about that because it's quite funny. But
no, that works.
That works. Yeah, that works. But
that works. I like it. Actually, if you think of it like that, it puts the memory in perspective. No, okay. So. All right, so basically in this one, we're talking about how you cannot trust your recollections. You can only get clarity from the present moment. And a lot of times what we think happened never happened. And one of the things you said that I really liked, before I want you to finish telling that story, is that I finally got a little bit of a glimpse into time is constantly escaping us. You say this over and over again in several publications. But then you gave an analogy of the washed footprints, the footprints being our past, and how to ask for the ocean of our mind to come and wash those away, and to see ourselves, instead of this long line, kind of in this sphere where you only see the few past footsteps, but the goal is to be centered in the middle of this sphere. And if we're centered there, then we're not so influenced, or like we said, that dominance and heavy focus on the past, because we're in the present moment. So
and what I'll do is I'll reiterate the question for you before we go into this. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to.
No worries.
Okay, so when you die, something leaves, and what leaves is a very, very vacuous part of yourself. So that could be good. That could be called the vacuous process or the heavenly process. The earthly process then sinks to the ground. When someone dies, their body becomes heavy like lead, and something leaves them. Now, this goes back to the double, in terms of what is the double really doing inside of my being? How can a duplicate of myself be revealed while I'm living? Because I'm already dead. So if I'm already dead, the time that I got left is then an expression of all the elements that I need to understand. If I've already my time's already finished. So I'm in a state of mourning at the moment because my life is finished. So when my life is finished, then the double will solicit growth mechanisms in terms of taking the solidification of our three-dimensional universe and then putting it into a holographic form. So my double left the bed, and as it left, the bed rose like this. So my wife saw this in its sequence, but I had another sequence of events occurring. So it's so because there was a difference in what she experienced in comparison to what I experienced, they were altered in their organization. She saw me getting out of bed, going to the bathroom, but instead of going to the bathroom, standing at the end of the bed, frighten the hell out of her. She's seen me a dozen times like that. So don't worry, I'm loose. My body's loose. My double is loose because I've already finished. So because I'm already finished, I've got the opportunity to discover so much magic and so much information because it's already done, but I've still got time left. So then there's time left. So my double is loose. So it leaves, and this is how you die. This particular portion of yourself leaves, but it stood at the end of the bed. It didn't leave to allow me to die. So when it left, I had a kind of like a physical seizure. As I was having a physical seizure, as it left, this was meant to happen. There's nothing wrong with me. It's just that I was like this, and she was very, very concerned. So she came over and said, "Well, I can see that." I said, "Don't worry." But she remembers the whole event in a different way. But I said, "Don't worry, I'm seeing God." That's why my double's at the end of the bed, because it's leaving me to allow me have access to something I wouldn't have access to because I'm already gone. Do you kind of understand? So because I had this leaving me, it only left to a couple of feet away from me, and this happened sequentially. You know, it was like it happened one night, and then 3 nights later, it happened again, and the whole experience was amplified in a different way every single time. But as far as the events occurred for her, it was different to the way it occurred for me because I was transdimensional and physically simultaneously there in the room. So because I was transdimensional and I was physical, there was something else could enter to show me the manifestation of a universal process which I wouldn't have access to. So it gave me access to that to show me something that I couldn't really understand or comprehend, which I'm very, very grateful for because it humbled me. But as I was watching this fractal anomaly fold in on itself, it's just like hand movements folds in on itself like this, you know. So then I was subject to something that allowed me to slip through that crack. And as I slipped through that crack, I got an enormous amount of information in terms of how the universe propagates itself with such intelligence that it was a reverberation, a drum which pounded back on me to show me that there's so much more to be realized. Will I realize it here, or will I realize it somewhere else? That's a good question, because maybe I'm not coming back, but where am I going? So it's so you look at this anomaly, and then because it's so humbling, as I was actually seeing God, my double was at the end of the bed, my body was shaking, and my spine turned to gold. And as it turned to gold, I realized something about the central part of my nervous system, and about because I haven't taken the advantage of using the prospect of finding something physical to dominate and becomes extraordinarily special. I found something so extraordinarily special because I denied myself certain things that I knew if I indulged in, this wouldn't have happened. So something quite tremendous happened, and then my spine, the rootlets, all the sound wave from the rootlets came out on different frequencies. So you could say there were 11 rootlets on each spinal opening of 33 vertebrae, and these rootlets started to sing together, and my spine turned into golden light. And then it read the predisposition, the physical predisposition of my wife, and I said, "Don't worry, I can feel you." These rootlets went into her body, started to generate a formulation of what's going on with the heartbeat, with the blood pressure and everything like that, because she was in a state of fear because she did not really understand what was happening to this at this particular point. She's so beautiful. She's so empty. She's she's a very, very beautiful person. But because the way she is, I'm progressing very, very fast because I'm anchored in such a beautiful, soft person. So, like I said, I'm the man I am because of my wife. So it's not because I'm good and she doesn't realize. I am that man. I am grateful for her, because this propelled me into another aspect of my growth as a spirit being outside of the confines of a physical presentation, into being divided into physical and then transdimensional, and then slipping in between the gap, and being allowed, or being humbly allowed, to actually view something which I couldn't have viewed if I would have gone down another pathway. So then, that's all I can say about that, really. In terms, yeah.
No, that's good, because what I want to do is I want to take the story you just gave and think of your recollection and Miss Pod's recollection and hold the two of those and compare them with the story in the book with the boy and donkey and his father.
Yeah, yeah. But the thing is that her events, she was a little bit fearful at that particular point. She's seen me do this a dozen times, but because we were sleeping. She usually sees it when she's doing her yoga, and she sees me in two places at once. And she doesn't get frightened at that, but she got frightened in the middle of the night. She's very, very tender, very, very sensitive human being. So it's very easy to frighten her in terms of that. So that's why I'm so protective of her, because she's very, very easily moved. She's like a very, very delicate string on a harp. It's such a beautiful tune that it's so sensitized to the environment that it rings in a certain way. So you know, to respect that is to honor that, and I gave her comfort by speaking to her as I was in 3 different places at once with clarity. But that doesn't it could be assigned to misplaced memories, because the sequence of events was different for her. She would see me go to the end of the bed. She didn't quite remember it in the same sequence. And I had a different events in terms of the sequence as well. So then that would cause doubt, wouldn't it? So there was no doubt in my mind what occurred. There was no doubt in her mind what occurred. It's just that she said to me, well, the sequence is different to what you said. And I said, yeah, of course it is. Because her frame of reference is a very protective wife towards a very loving husband, and you know, that's the way she saw it. That's the way she saw it, as far as I'm concerned. But the truth of what occurred to me is different to what she saw. But never would I demote her capacity to understand what she understood. I just said, just be careful you don't relegate it to something certain, because what happened is surrounded by uncertainty. And
Right.
You know, so, and you know, it's just like to allow me to unfold as a human being is very, very generous of her, you know. So I know that she's accompanied me before. I know it, and because she's accompanied me in this way, she's my other half. She's the completion of my journey. So that I know for a fact that we are split in two. We are split in two, but we're one person. And this is something that is very, very hard to define. In the Tibetan culture, they understand this. I understand very well. So she's the part which completes me. I'm the part which completes her. And then whatever the burdens and the journey are in life, we have to, through thick and thin, never allow each other to be dropped in any way whatsoever, because we are one person. And that's what union really, really means, where you become one person. You find they say your soulmate, but you may find the other part of yourself which completes you.
Which I guess some people refer to as a twin flame, but the bottom line is that one being that's beautiful in two bodies
but aren't we all one being anyway? And from a universal perspective, even if we're extraterrestrial, we're still one being. We're still one being. It's just the entanglement.
The level of feeling.
Yeah, the level of feeling. Just say that I realize something and it's not of this world. Then the aspect of the elements of realization. When I realize something, a culture will look around and commune with you in terms of what you realize, and then your journey truly begins in terms of the entanglement of what you're meant to realize, because you've realized something that may have very well to do with where you're meant to where your journey is meant to go.
So for those of us that might be having a problem connecting and feeling that oneness of all of humanity being one entity in several bodies, if we experience it on the microcosm, like between in a loving relationship, that realization will help us to realize the oneness with all other human beings.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of like that.
yeah, kind of. Okay.
Kind of like that.
And so basically, when you talk about like the boy, and everybody needs to know that, you know, the story of the boy that whose father returned after a long absence, and he, with motive, said, I'll forgive him if he's basically going to be good enough, and he didn't meet his expectations, and he was very angry, versus in part one versus in part two, something totally different. And you talked about the differences between the memory being tainted and a biased missed opportunity, which you spoke about with the recall in your situation, versus the Akashic record. So it's not like it's your view or Mizpah's views. One of them is going to be, a more, I would think, if I misunderstand, correct me.
Or if you understand correctly, you don't misunderstand correctly.
But if I understood, or if I think I do, that the Akashic record would be more objective in terms of from multiple perspectives as opposed to just one. And so to be able to look at that and say, because you said that you were saying that how you wouldn't demote her recollection or anything like that, and you also termed that as a weaponized form of remembrance.
Yeah.
I like that.
To honor what somebody sees, and knowing that you've seen something exactly the same but it's different. To honor that without the differentiation between judgment, no judgment in between, and to have the difference, to have that variability is very, very important. But to respect other people's variability is very, very important. In terms of if your spirit body becomes different to you, this is your mind, and then it becomes the center of your spiritual awareness in terms of growing into something different. You have to let go of one to grasp the other, but you're still contained within the first one, even though you're moving to something quite ethereal. Sounds like dying, doesn't it? Sounds like being reborn before you die.
Which so it's a preferable.
It's preferable. It's a preemptive motive of the universe to give you what you're going to become before you become that, the opportunity to integrate it before you enter that. So the opportunity to integrate the lifetime before you get there is a true boon. It's to be grateful that you're moving into that realm of consciousness before you move into that realm of consciousness, because you're trying to deal with the karmic effect and the loop of this particular karmic effect by being somewhere which has got nothing to do with the wooden spokes and everything to do with the holographic effect of those particular realizations in an area which is so subtle.
So you asked the question, which memory will we hold on to? The curse of the projections that are filled with motive, or the perspective of the Akashic record, and that our discernment of missed opportunities is where we will find true compassion between our misplaced memories.
Yeah, it's basically just taking responsibility for the moment, instead of bringing the memories into that moment which don't really correspond with the responsibilities of that particular moment. So people have a bad feeling, they bring that bad feeling into the moment. That moment then is truly divided at that particular point, because they can't do what's really meant to be done, because they brought what the wrong memory into that moment, and then the transformation of that moment can't occur, because it loops back into a repetitive expectation of emotional discomfort. And you want to transfer that emotional discomfort to somebody else. If you don't bring that emotional discomfort into your new moments, then you become responsible for what really needs to be done. And when you do what really needs to be done, you're free of the previous. And the latter is something that has enormous magic interwoven within it, by letting go of what you can exchange with, instead of exchanging with the responsibility of what you really need to do in the new moment. Which really essentially means that are you following the governing law of your heart process in the environment, and will the environment yield to you those true moments in terms of your capacity to fish, catch worms, and grab seed from the coconut tree, or will you be contained within a past irrelevant feeling which is erroneous in comparison to the circumstance, and ask somebody else to fish for you, and wake up in a timely fashion. I don't want to give away the chapter completely, but
yes,
it's very, very obvious in the book that there are particular ways to proceed, and there are particular ways to proceed.
Got to pick the right particular way. All right, let's go into the undoing, where you know, kind of the quote that I took from that as a governing quote is to plan to be somewhere before you arrive is a mistake. You make that statement and you tell a story about a friend who is trying to support someone about to go through the transition, but it teaches us also how to interact with those who have a heavy burden.
Okay, you're mentioning somebody, I counseled someone when they were dying, and accompanied them on the journey, because they wanted some form of comfort in terms of being really understood. I couldn't really be there. It was done by distance, but I've honored her in the front of the book very strongly, because she allowed me to be that way with her, and I've done that with a few people, and it's very, very strong. It's a very, very beautiful thing to see somebody entering into an area which in one case brings fear, in another case brings fulfillment and completion. As long as you don't upset them, and you put them in a position where they feel good about themselves, you of noble family, you know. So there has to be of a noble content to bring them stability, not fear, not crying, not anything else other than bringing them into their stability of who they're really meant to be in that transition. And that is governed by their discernment, and their discernment becomes so acute, and it's a very, very dangerous period. So it's I don't know what else to say about that.
Well, you talk about easing their dilemma by opening our hearts deeply in the moment to receive what they need, and that's that validation, that's that support came from that space, and that being in a position of non-judgment for however they got there is the first step to forgiveness and compassion toward ourselves and the others. And you mentioned that this was perfecting the art of living and dying simultaneously.
Yeah, when you look at the young boy, there was no communion because he was separated. When you look at the second young boy, he was in a state of communion because he took responsibility, even though he didn't really know why the father was sleeping. You know, so taking responsibility opens up a very, very beautiful door in terms of doing what needs to be done, and do it with such an appropriateness that you open a very, very special door for someone to unfold and tell you the reasons why. If you can't tell the reasons why, or you can't really truly express, then that door is closed by the behavioural pattern of someone who doesn't really understand. I hope I'm not being confusing here, but this tale is very, very simple but extremely complex in the same breath. So if we do what needs to be done, then we're fully in the educational process of actually growth by not anchoring ourselves where we don't really need to be anchored, but to discover who we really can be in the moment without being anchored into a past or previous idea of something, which becomes erroneous emotional content because we've emphasized the wrong elements within ourselves.
The undoing is a constant process of, again, akin to not doing, not allowing the past to trip us. And it's a beautiful way to support, you know, by being in that space. And that example teaches us how to be in that space and support our others, but also show compassion and kindness to ourselves.
Yeah. Or to be in a state of comprehension where we don't even think about ourselves. You become unaware of who you are because you do what needs to be done. Do you understand? Because
I like that. Then we're not aware of. Yeah.
Yeah. If you have the idea that you're being compassionate, you've got something to defend. But if you do something with just the pure notion of fulfilling a plan or a need without expecting anything in exchange you allow that other person to reveal themselves to you. Because if you hold something that you need to reveal back to them because you've done something righteous, you may block them from actually unraveling what they need to unravel.
Ah, okay. So that's some of the undoing that is happening, is that we're allowing ourselves to facilitate some of their undoing at that moment.
Yeah, because you're not in a containment field of looking for recognition. If you're in the
Right.
containment field of looking for recognition, you've got something to defend. So no recognition means you nothing to defend. But there are circumstances where you have to speak on occasions, obviously. But when you practice this, you actually realize that having no idea of who you are and why you are doing it is better than having the idea of who you are and why you're doing it.
I'm gonna let that one sit.
Yeah.
But I wanted to go into
Okay, Andrew.
two chapters
Okay,
kind of together. Being in
okay.
the is that yeah, being in the world and
No,
not
I
of
was
it.
just going to say you froze for a second. Sorry about
Oh,
that.
okay. I
Yeah.
wanted to go into the chapter and compare these two together, being in the world and not of it, and the passerby, because the passerby principle kind of it threads throughout. And
Mm.
so, in looking at those, there are a couple of things that you used for examples. One is exploring the Tibetan Book of the Dead by applying the passerby principle. But before we get into that, you spoke in the very beginning about how, as a young student, the master teacher at the monastery allowed you to listen to ancient and sacred texts that you said could not be understood by the interpretive system of the waking mind, but for the purpose of hiding wisdom deep within one's consciousness so as to arrive on their elusiveness through the mundane world that calls them to the surface when needed. And I found that to be very interesting because if we look at
Okay,
some,
now,
go
yeah,
ahead.
this is very sorry if I'm bumping
No,
into
go
you
ahead.
again. When you listen to something from an ancient language, it has a vibration, or it has an information embedded within it. So when you listen to something you can't really understand, you absorb the vibration, and the vibration will become applicable in terms of your own framework, and the expression of that pertinence will become valuable in terms of not interpreting anything, but coming upon something which isn't interpreted, so that you can renew yourself without the understanding of how you've been renewed, because the frequency goes in, and then it becomes amplified in a way once it settles into your body, and whichever vertebrae lets go of the frequency, or the amplification of that particular frequency, it will be amplified within the personal range of reference of your true personality. Personal, true person, your true personality. So this is determined by the shape of your face, the length of your bones, and everything like this. So you take into consideration that we're a composite of information within a vibratory system. We're like a building. We're a sacred temple. Within that sacred temple, everybody will let emanate from them the sacredness of their being within the shape and the content of that particular temple. So people are different. So then you've got to honor that difference in terms of what is going to manifest because of the different length of the bones. It's like a diagnosis. You look at somebody's face, you can diagnose the content of their realizations through their evolutionary process by how now. This is you look at somebody's face when they're in their 60s and 70s, you can see that they've made great mistakes, because the marks on their face are very, very deep. The content of their suffering is very, very deep. So it's so when you look at this, it's if somebody has an animal, the animal ends up looking like them, or the person ends up looking like the animal. So you have an exchange, and that exchange is I hope I'm making sense here. That exchange
Yep.
is pertinent in terms of the value of the reverberation of that relationship, revealing the content of your features in like similarity. Like everyone says, "Oh, you and Miss look very, very similar," and I say, "Yeah, of course we look similar because we're in love with each other and we're on the same path." obviously we're going to end up having the same resonant field vibrating in the variation of that body compared to this body. So then it's then the full circle of the realization of this repetitive loop coming upon us in a way which is magical, because there are two entities intertwined, and then you've got this figure eight motion, which is a perfect circle. And a perfect circle like this is a perfect circle. So the perfect circle always comes back to its original point, but as it travels, that original point will always be stationary, but it will always change in terms of the value of the content of information that goes through that. So that's kind of like a yin yang symbol in a continual loop. Yeah.
No, that does make sense. That does make sense. So we can liken that vibratory resonance. Sorry. Like you were talking about the kind of the locked mantra of I am mountain, I am. When you told the boys, when the Grove Master told the boys to recite it without knowing it, there was the vibratory resonance that was going to embed the wisdom that was necessary. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. In comparison to the person's life path in terms of what they're really meant to do. And it's very, very difficult to realize what we're really meant to do. You know, so everyone will know that when they were 20, they almost went down there. When they were 25, they went down this path, or they retract, or they got caught in that path. I have definite lines of resonance where I could have gone down many, many different paths, but halfway down I said, no, I'm going back. I'm not getting caught in that. Or the circumstances decided for me that you're not going down that path, and then it finished. So there are two opportunities: going down a path that you're unconscious of, going down a path that somebody devises for you, and then that devised path stops. You know, it's a very, very interesting thing in terms of what we can be subject to in one lifetime. As long as we have the capacity to be malleable enough, or exchange with the circumstances, to shape shift instead of being shifted into a shape.
Yeah, I can reflect on my life and know how I was shaped into something I didn't want to be. Incurred a lot of student loans doing so. But then to be able, when you reach that point of awareness where you're able to shape shift into what appears to be what you should be becoming.
Yeah, and what you should be, what you could become really shouldn't be emphasized by should. But what you become is something quite valuable, because you didn't realize you're going to become that, because there's no set stage for who you believe you're going to become. There's no set stage for that. There's only set stages that you leave behind. So, ooh, I'm so lucky I didn't get caught in that one. I'm so lucky I didn't get caught in that one. And then you realize you don't know really who you are. And if you don't know really who you are, you've got a tremendous advantage by not knowing who you are, and to become an absolute mirror of every circumstance you enter, and you become the conduit of all those circumstances, because you don't define yourself, or you don't enter that room with the notion that I've arrived. You enter the room, and the room will allow you to arrive in the vibratory essence of that room, instead of you going in with the idea of yourself. So don't ever, like I said to my students, I said, don't decide who you're going to be when you come to the room, because it's not going to be what you think.
Right. And that goes back to, you saying don't plan to be somewhere before you arrive. And the fact that when we enter a room, we take on the characteristics, and the room reflects back to us who we are and what's needed in that moment. So that comes back.
Or the room they enter, which is my office, then reflects the steadfast nature of immovability, which is malleable.
Immovability is malleable?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Immovability is malleable. So if somebody comes into the room, and like when you come into the room, when you come to do gravity, I'll say, well, everything's set. Don't move it because it's set. If you move it, it'll take a month for it to reset itself. So everything is set in place, and it's set in a way which causes the room is different inside than when you're outside. I mean, this is something you're going to have to experience. The room is different When you get into the room, you're contained by the room, but when you get outside of the room, you realize the containment of the room is gone because you go outside, and you realize there's a harshness outside and a softness inside, and there's a power inside that room because it's set. And it's set by the value of being very, very aware of where I put things and never move them, because then they gain power because they're located in one spot. So it's a temple-like structure in terms of the value of how it's been. If I move one thing, I have to move 5 things. So I only when I put something in, I watch it very, very carefully to see what it's meant to do. And I have two frequency machines in the room. One's vibrating one Wi-Fi signal, which is very, very friendly to human consciousness, and there's another which I can adjust into maybe the frequency of the sun, or the frequency of love, or the frequency of happiness. So the frequencies emanate into the room in comparison to what's being set in terms of the value of all the objects being subject to a higher resonance, even though they don't move. But the higher resonance affects the foundation of the movement of the room, because the room is immovable. But the frequency will change within the room in comparison to who enters.
So then, can we liken that room to your stories of whether we are going through Bardo or going through the light, how that becomes a container to who we are when we walk into
Okay. Absolutely, exactly. So it's so preemptively saying I'm going to do this when I get there won't work, because when you get there, something else will happen, not what you expect. And so when we go through Bardo, we've got to have a particular formula of non-expectation. Yet to have having the power of non-expectation will be faced in life by something which is disruptive, and you've got to say to yourself, that's an illusion, that I'm going to move through this, and that's exactly the same attitude we've got to have when we're dying. But the discernment is so different when we pass over. And I have the memories of this particular discernment. I sent you a picture of something which will rush at you. Now, I've got this on my back from Bali. It was tattooed on my back. But when you see this, it comes at you with such velocity that the interpretation of that velocity will then capture something which you haven't resolved. And turn it into something you can't handle. If you can handle what you can't handle in life, then it's a preparation for death. So you know that comes into you, and if it somehow hits a part of you that's unresolved, then that unresolved nature will be amplified. Same when you die. So then the journey of obstacles in life are very, very important to come to terms with a certain amount of subtleties in terms of discernment, to realize that this is what's going to happen to us when we die. So it's really important to stay calm in the face of diversity, because in a lot of ancient wisdoms they say there's no difference between success and failure. Yes, there is, but you've got to realize that you in your success and in your failure, you've got to stay the person that you're really meant to be. Oh, that looks like a face, doesn't it? So when you realize this. Neither one matters. What matters is how you integrate either one. When you're in a favorable situation, it's easy. When you're in an unfavorable situation, it's not so easy, because suffering is then put on the altar of your perception. You've got to deal with that particular suffering, and who you become because of that suffering is your responsibility.
And that's being prepared, as you said, and doing the work before we get to Bardo, doing the living Bardo techniques, continually practicing being, knowing, and not doing, so that in that moment we're better able to handle what needs to happen in that moment.
Yeah. So if you see your body as a framework, as a net, so throwing a net like this and catching fish, it's exactly the way. Be a fisherman of men. Be a fisherman of what's inside of you. To capture what's inside of you and discover what's flopping around and not resolved. Be a fisherman, but being a fisherman of men means that you ask men to be a fisherman of what they can't handle.
Say that again, please. Being a fisherman of men makes you a fisherman of what you cannot handle. Is that what you said?
Yeah, you teach people to be efficient. If you're a fisherman of men, you take the content of what's captured inside of them, and you take the fish out, you put it in the bucket and say, look what we caught. Being a fisherman of yourself, in terms of being a fisherman of men, taking that warmth and catching fish, you have to put that net on yourself and try and capture what you haven't seen or what you haven't noticed within yourself as well. So
Okay.
there was always reverse. Oh, almost knocked my thing off there. It's always a reverse engineering of everything which is put forward to gain value of that in terms of what haven't you noticed as you sink into your body? What haven't you noticed? What haven't you noticed, or what do you notice when someone pressures you? And that's the net. You have enough discernment to capture that particular elusive fish in the depths of your being, which isn't obvious to you, and you make it obvious. You attempt to make it as so obvious as possible to allow it to dissolve into emptiness through the resistances of that particular feeling, so that when you do go through the net of Bardo, because it's a net. Be a fisherman of men. When you go through Bardo, it'll capture those fish you haven't realized that are locked in the depths of your being that you haven't resolved. And as you go through that net, Bardo captures it and throws it back at you with such fury because your discernment is so clear. But in life, you have to discover that discernment while you live to watch for those things that you didn't notice inside of yourself. In comparison to the ramifications of circumstances coming at you, you don't look at other people. You look at how you're responding. If you respond in a way which is reactionary, you're not empty enough. If you respond in a way to gather men, to gather women, to gather people and give it back to them, you're a fisherman of those particular people. But it's not really understood. So the only way to, when you're in a universal state of openness, yes, you become a fisherman of what comes swimming inside of you, because those depths you've already dredged those depths and got them empty. As soon as somebody's fish comes in, you feel it moving around because it's them inside of you, not you inside of you. So being a fisherman of men, you have to be a fisherman of your own unruly nature first. And once that becomes empty, then you don't go out and be a fisherman of men. You wait for them to enter you, and then you reveal what you're seeing, and then your fate is sealed, as somebody's fate was sealed because of this.
Okay.
It's a very arduous and complex journey.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Now, when I kept listening to the chapter, The Passerby, over and over again, for the longest time, I could not figure out exactly what was the passerby. And please correct my understanding or misunderstanding, that after realizing
I'll say something before you start. Be of the world, but not of it.
Yes.
It's a very, very profound saying. Be of the world, but not of it. It's in Taoism, it's in Buddhism. Be of the world, but don't be part of it. And be separate from it, but be of service to it. Because you can't be separate.
That's the passerby.
Yeah, be of service, but don't be of it. Understand it, don't judge it.
Okay.
Because you just to be a passerby is you watch and notice. And while you watch and notice, who do you become while you're watching and notice? While you're watching and noticing, who do you become? That's the obstacle, that's the test. Who do you become because you put yourself in this position? If you don't become somebody, then it's a burn. If you become somebody, then it's a failure.
So that's when you said that the goal kind of graduating Bardo is to be the passerby. That makes a little bit more sense now. Sometimes it's just something simple that doesn't click.
Yeah, but if you notice something and you become wholeheartedly connected to that, this will be emphasized inside of your being as that you captured something within the net of your spirit body. If your spirit body catches somebody else's fish in your net, that's fine. But if you discover that you've captured yourself within your own net, you got work to do. But you got work to do when other people enter as well. So that's what being of service is, to capture what they can't find within the depth of their being.
You gave an example of the dream that you had about the illusion that appeared to be your wife that was not your wife, and how you dealt with that illusion, and how it was imposed upon you, or did you bring it in that light with you? And I wanted to talk
No,
about the different
it was a
methods.
test.
Yeah,
It
okay.
was an absolute test. It was an absolute test of reactivity. I didn't react. So the white light became available at that particular point in terms of that experience. And that experience really did happen. But and it was an actual dream visionary sequence, which I put in the book, which was quite rewarding in a lot of ways, because the white light, if you understand the process of if you let go of your mind sinks into your body, you become full of white light. But also you can become full of white light through a particular technique of taking the light of the moon into your body to strengthen the capacity of this white light to spread. It's called soma. In India, the process is called soma pavamana. So the somic revelations within your body have got to do with the content of your. You could say this is a yang process, but when you look at the moon is a yin process in comparison to the sun.
Right.
So you take that moonlight, and it becomes softened as it goes into the earth process. But the earth process reveals that the hallways of light are filled with this very, very graduated substance, which you can make appear in between your hands. Yeah.
You keep alluding to that. One day you're going to show us, maybe?
Oh, well, I'll show you when you come to the office.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
So you also talked about that there were many types of white light. And can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because you get little bits and pieces in some of your publications about, but can you please?
Ooh. Now, this is the difficult subject, because when I go into this subject, goes into the woo-woo area. Now,
because we talk about the entities that appear in the white light, or you mentioned, I don't remember which book it was about.
In Who Am I mentioned that, because these particular beings had a triangular head, a very, very long-limbed body, but they were an advanced technological race which had left a mechanism of a discernment in terms of creating a white light to draw the humanity back to the earthly process, because we don't belong in an interstellar community because we're too violent. But whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, we've reverse engineered the technology of these particular beings, and this will be revealed pretty soon. But and we're out there now, but we're out there in terms of only a few people in the secret space program, which I'm very aware of, which is part of a process which has got to do with shadows in the twilight, and it's got to do with a process of 500 years in the future, back to this particular moment, to establish a change of consciousness in terms of the evolutionary process. Because if you do travel transdimensionally in a vehicle that has got to do with moving along the web-like substance of our universe, there is a great evolutionary process which comes upon beings, because their thought process cannot exist inside these crafts, and also the process of the crafts can be created in a very, very specific way within the density of these transdimensional avenues of pathways which they travel in, which changes them, and they can't be anything other than universally correctly applying themselves to the principles and laws. You don't get there by breaking laws; you get there by abiding by the laws themselves. So there are no violent entities out there. There's only violent entities here. And the reason why I mentioned the process of the moon and a false white light is to enter that white light and be sent back. Because there is something, I don't know, I don't really want to go down this path, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit, because it makes me look like a nutter. There is a technology which is affecting us, which is billions of years in advance to what we really expect. and it's got to do with the location of the moon, and it's got to do with the moon itself. And this white light and these entities have done this, and I've experienced so many different elements of this particular phenomena, but I've seen that white light. It's not really real, and I put it in that book, and but I didn't really explain that there are more than one type of white light. There's a white light of containment. There's a white light other than the containment. It's just, do we have the discernment to discover which is which?
And if we discern it, well, if we are able to discern it, then we'll know in that moment what we need to do.
Well, it'll be done for us in terms of whatever is unresolved inside of us will reveal the return or the future journey of that particular being.
So we'll be attracted to the white light appropriate for our growth.
Yes, kind of, but can you see through what is appearing in front of you? So that it's very, very important for us to develop the sort of like moon-like substance within our body, so that that discernment in terms of our progress can be solidified as the white light of our progress will be what confronts us in terms of our reflective mechanism. If we don't develop the white light, then we'll be faced with something that we haven't developed. And is it real or is it false? So there are lots of traps surrounding us as a humanity, because our immaturity is profound.
Our immaturity
is profound.
That's kind of sad. It's true, I know, but it's so sad. Well, I mean, there was a lot we went over today with Bardo, and a lot of it overlapped. But we're going to start next time with Heaven and Earth. But before we close out, is there any, I mean, there's so much good stuff in here, but is there any point that you feel led to leave us with before we end this one?
There is always something unexpected when we drop our expectations. So, yeah, I wish I could tell exactly what I've gone through and give that information, but I have to wait until there's an enormous amount of disclosure and opening in this area. Otherwise, I'll relegated to the basket.
People will redress you according to them 200 stones.
Yes, 200 cobblestones.
Yes.
Oh, I did it again. Yeah, so there's really nothing else that I can really say about that. Okay. But there is an evolutionary process that we will be subject to in terms of forms of disclosure at the moment. And Dr. Greer is the only one that I trust in terms of this disclosure process. Everything else doesn't really fit. It doesn't feel right. Yeah, so it will be happening. It'll be going to Congress. It'll be defined very soon. If it's not defined, it'll be buried once again. And we've lost 100 years of progress because of the implementation of saying, well, we'll take this, we'll shelve it, instead of progressive change happening, because we're meant to go like this, and then all of a sudden we go boom. And at the moment we're kept in this very, very strange elevation where growth actually happens like that, crack really quick. It's just like AI is going to be like this. It'll crack open all the boundaries because that's the way things happen. They don't happen progressively, they happen suddenly. And we're in an era where things are going to happen suddenly, very suddenly. That's all I got to say about that.
Well, that is wonderful. Well, once again, just in conclusion, the Bardo, whether it's the pearly gates, those are reflective thresholds that reveal who we have been and possibly who we are. We want to continue to practice knowing, being, and not doing, so that when we get there, we will know what we need to do and be in that moment. And next video, we will start with Heaven and Earth and finish out the book.
Okay. It's really lovely talking to you.
Thank you, really Lujan. This has been good stuff as always. And until next time.
Okay. Lots of love to you. Lots of love to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay.